Hello starfarers, and welcome back to the Tetra Galaxy Telecast. For this transmission's topic, we'll be taking a look at something which has caused some degree of, to put it nicely, less than civil discourse within the Metroid community. That, of course, would be the debate of what's canon or non-canon in the Metroid series. Because of the tense air surrounding the discussion, I'd like to provide a chronological timeline of every canon entry in the Metroid story so far. I'm also doing this because there are some pieces of Metroid media that I don't believe many have enjoyed and want to bring attention to. However, I won't be covering supplementary materials, or in other words, I'm not discussing canon material like game manuals, player's guides, promotional websites, or other works of that like. But without further delay, let's begin. First, I have to establish the points of contention amongst Metroid fans for what's canon and what's not first. To put it in simple terms, there are 4 categories of Metroid media that fans argue over regarding their status in the Metroid timeline. These 4 categories are 1. The remade games, or Metroid 1 and Metroid 2, 2. The Prime series, 3. Other M, and 4. The mangas, of which there are only 2, the prequel manga and the Samus and Joey manga. These are the most controversial of the categories because they aren't games like the other entries in the timeline. With these 4 categories in mind, I figure you've quickly deduced that there are 5 games that are near unanimously seen as canon entries into the Metroid franchise, but just in case any of you didn't catch it, I'll put it to words. I won't be discussing Zero Mission, Samus Returns, Super Metroid, Metroid Fusion, or Metroid Dread in this broadcast, as there are simply not enough people who view them as non-canon to be worth covering. You really can't deny the 5. One last thing before starting, I'll be talking about these games and mangas in chronological order, and since I've got all the preamble out of the way, that of course means I'll be starting with... The argument used against the manga I've seen the most is that it's not a game, and that the creators of the series have never directly stated it as being canon, so therefore it isn't. However, I have to disagree with them, because while the manga has never been referenced directly as canon by someone like Sakamoto in an interview or other questionnaires of that kind, the manga has been acknowledged by the games themselves on more than one occasion. Specifically, I'm referring to Zero Mission and Dread, which having already established that those 2 are indisputably canon, their acknowledgments of the manga should prove that it's canon as well. In Zero Mission, a drawing made by a young Samus is depicted in the ancient shrine of Chozodia, which backs the manga's depiction of Samus being raised by the Chozo, a detail shared with the flashbacks Samus has when she sees the Chozodian mural. Specifically, she is shown next to Old Bird, and where was Old Bird first introduced? That's right, the manga. Dread further backs this backstory of being raised by the Chozo, when it's revealed that Ravenbeak was one of the DNA donors to Samus when the Chozo infused her with their own DNA to help her survive Zebes' harsh conditions and become the warrior she turned out to be. The chamber where the infusion happens is even depicted as being the same room from the manga, with at most some very slight alterations to its visual design. Seeing as 2 of the unanimously canon games directly adopt the manga into Metroid lore, it's hard to argue against its status as canon. That's without mentioning Metroid Fusion and Zero Mission's secret images, which also recognize various moments first shown in the manga. I separated these from the other in-game references though, because they can only be unlocked in the child mode of the Japanese versions of the game. But even being region exclusive, I'd say that the images still count. They're part of the 5. The Metroid prequel manga first debuted in 2002, and since then, 3 out of the 4 mainline games have directly referenced it. So despite what some may say about it, the games seem to believe that the manga is canon, and from that lens, I think it's impossible to deny its place in the Metroid timeline. Since Metroid 1 already has a remake, the question surrounding the game is whether or not it's replaced by the timeline in Zero Mission. To be frank, Nestroid is canon, and the existence of the remake doesn't change that. Some of you might be wondering how both versions can be canon at the same time though. So how can that be? Well, while there are some minor differences between the two and some major additions to Zero Mission specifically, they're both telling the same story, meaning that despite any differences, the part of the timeline they share is identical. With that viewpoint, both versions of Metroid 1 have to be in the timeline. If the original wasn't canon, that would mean that the story it's telling isn't canon. Since the remake is telling that same story, it would have to be removed from the timeline as well, since it was already established that its story isn't canon, regardless of the added details. In other words, if the original version of Metroid 1 is a non-canon entry into the franchise, the story is stricken as well, and since the remake is telling the same story, it'd be non-canon by proxy. Any additions to the remake like Chozodia are canon, despite not being in the original version, because the remake, being the same part of the timeline, can add what it wants to the lore of that story, as long as it tells the same overall story as the original, which Zero Mission does. The argument I made applies to Return of Samus and Samus Returns as well, so both of those games are also canon. With the original versions of Metroid 1 and 2 covered, we can now move on to the next category, but before I do, I'd quickly like to mention that as a fan game, AM2R is non-canon, and any lore added to that game specifically should be viewed as such. But that's all on the mainline games for now. Now the Prime games are definitely the category that's the most accepted out of the four as being canon, but I'll be covering them quickly just for the so-called 2D purists out there. There are a couple of key elements in the series that show the sub-series is a part of the timeline, the first and most prominent of which is Proteus Ridley. Since I've already established that Samus Returns is among the 5 undoubtedly canon games, that means Proteus Ridley is as well. That said, if the Prime games weren't canon, why would he be here? Or at the very least, why would he be a half-mechanical, half-organic creature? Is it perhaps because he was previously mechanized in a certain game from 2002? Yeah, the connection's pretty obvious. Another pretty obvious connection is the sudden decline of the space pirate forces. I mean, ask yourself, why did the space pirates, who were going toe-to-toe with the Galactic Federation during the time of the prequel manga and Metroid 1, being stated to control over 200 countries across several planets like Jagrod, suddenly get pushed back to a single planet in Metroid 2 and 3. I mean, Samus did do a number to their forces on Zebes, don't get me wrong, but considering she didn't even kill any of the 3 highest ranking members of the Space Pirate military present at the time, let alone, destroy the planet, that clearly wasn't enough damage done to repulse the pirates to a single base planet. So how might they have been so drastically weakened? Maybe a certain power-hungry hunter got them wiped out in her failed quest to conquer the universe. I think it's pretty apparent at this point that Prime 3 is canon, with Proteus Ridley following as his next form, the machine parts of him filling in for the parts of his body that were lost after the disappearance of Phazon, along with Dark Samus' destruction resulting in the death of most of the Space Pirate forces. That also means that Prime 1 and 2 are canon, as there are scans present in Prime 3 that acknowledge Samus' actions and their consequences on both Talon 4 and Aether. That leaves the spin-offs, Pinball, Hunters, and Federation Force. Hunters doesn't really offer too much to prove it's canon, but it doesn't need to, because the one piece of evidence it provides is all the proof it needs. That proof is one item, the Omega Canon. The reason this item is so important to proving that Prime Hunters is canon is that it later appears in Metroid Dread. Since Metroid Dread is one of the 5, and along with the fact that it acknowledges technology invented and established in Metroid Prime Hunters, should work together to show that Prime Hunters is also canon. Federation Force is next, and like Hunters, one piece of technology should show beyond doubt that this game is in the timeline: Master Brain. Master Brain is the AI unit operating the Doom's Eye, which the titular Federation Force defeats at the end of the game. Why is this important? Because Mother Brain was destroyed in Metroid 1, and throughout the Prime series, until Prime 3, the Space Pirates were operating without any advanced AI at the head of command. In Prime 3, of course, the Space Pirates successfully steal the Aurora unit on board the GFS Valhalla. The subsequent creation of Master Brain shows that after they took the Aurora unit, they figured out how to make their own AI units in the likeness of Mother Brain. I mean, how do you think they were able to rebuild her in Super Metroid to begin with? They learned how to do it by building Master Brain first, which also conveniently answers why they didn't go straight to rebuilding Mother Brain. They wanted to make sure they had the creation process down before bringing Mother Brain back to life. With 5 of 6 games down, Prime Pinball is the only one left. This one is the only game of these that I'd argue is non-canon. You could argue that this contradicts my earlier point about Metroid 1 and 2 and its remakes, but I'd argue that Prime Pinball can't be grouped in with the remakes due to its unique properties, by which I mean it's a pinball game. I believe that since Samus is a pinball in this game, it's not really telling the same story as Prime 1, where Samus is, of course, not a pinball. Speaking of story, there is a story mode, but it completely leaves out Magmore Caverns, which was a big part of Prime 1. For this and other minor reasons, I believe that Prime Pinball is the only non-canon Prime game in the series. I mean, if you really want to argue that the game is canon, you could, but only as like a dream Samus had, or maybe the Federation made a pinball game for its soldiers to play based on Samus's mission report after Prime 1, or something along those likes. But in short, all of the Prime games are canon except for Pinball, and even that could be canon, just not in the conventional sense. The main issue for Other M's canonicity is simply how much hate the game gets, with many choosing not to acknowledge it out of pure spite. Now don't get me wrong, I absolutely despise Other M. I could tear this game apart for hours. But you can't judge a game's canonicity based on its quality. That's just not how it works. Another reason is because of the aforementioned 2D purist lumping the game in with the other non-2D entries. But since I showed that the Prime games are canon, this argument is also rather redundant. That leaves the plot hole argument, or the idea that it can't be canon due to its numerous inconsistencies with the other Metroid games. While this is definitely the best of the 3 arguments, I'll have to disagree with this one too, as the plot holes in this game are just that, plot holes. There are plenty of other franchises that have multiple games or movies or something of the like, of which have multiple inconsistencies between entries. The most prominent example that comes to my mind is the Star Wars sequels, probably because I hate those too. And there are several inconsistencies with the older movies' established events, namely the destruction of the Death Star 2. The plot holes don't make the Disney trilogy non-canon though, much the same way Other M's plot holes don't make it non-canon. It's just a matter of bad, really bad, writing. I could even talk about the plot holes within other Metroid games, namely Zero Mission, but I think I'll save that for a later transmission. Having just knocked down the 3 major arguments against this game, it's time I brought out the smoking gun. In an interview speaking about the series, Sakamoto, the man in creative control of Metroid, confirmed himself that Other M is canon, albeit somewhat indirectly, saying, quote, "The real Samus is the one you will see in Other M." In case you needed any more convincing that Other M is part of the official timeline, it's also shown off in official artwork as an unlockable reward in Metroid Dread, along with the mainline games. That last point isn't a great argument on its own, since it could just be seen as a reference, but considering all the other points I made previously, I'd like to think this detail is more so just a cherry on top to prove beyond doubt the game is part of the timeline. Take it from me, the guy who will probably hate this game until the day I die, and then a few days after that. Other M is, unfortunately, canon. That leaves me with just one piece of Metroid media left to cover, and oh boy, as far as canonicity goes, it may very well be the most controversial of all the entries in this legendary franchise. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you... This, of all the entries covered in this transmission, is without a doubt the hardest to prove as canon. Samus and Joey is not one of the games, which hampers its canon perception, and it's not been directly confirmed as canon by someone like Sakamoto either. It also doesn't get the regular recognition from the game medium that the prequel manga enjoys. All told though, I still believe Samus and Joey is canon, as I think there's more arguments in its favor than against it to fit it into the timeline. The first of these favorable arguments is the references it gets in the games. Now I know I just said it isn't recognized by the games like the prequel manga, but while it's true that the story isn't acknowledged, the games don't acknowledge major characters from it, like Joey or Greed, the games do still nod to it sometimes, just in more subtle ways. The most prominent of these is Samus' signature thumbs down pose, which was first used in Samus and Joey, and is later used as a prominent story beat in Other M, among other references. Another of these arguments in its favor is the circumstances in which the manga was made. It was also worked on by Sakamoto and other creative directors of Metroid. He didn't write any of it himself, but he worked with the author to make sure it fit in with the other entries in the franchise, at least up to a point. The place where I'm getting this information from is what's most definitely the biggest point in Samus and Joey's corner, and that's an interview that Itsuki Kuji, I horribly mispronounced that, didn't I? Anyway, that's the author of the manga, was invited to by a group called the Shine Sparkers back in 2019. In that interview, he states the information I have repeated about working with Sakamoto and others on the project to fit it in the timeline, but more importantly, when asked specifically if it was meant to be a canon entry in the franchise, he states that it was made to fit between Super Metroid and Metroid Fusion chronologically. To me, that right there should make the manga canon, as the author literally said the manga is in the timeline and takes place between Super and Fusion. Also, if worth noting, Nintendo has never denounced Samus and Joey as non-canon, and while that doesn't explicitly prove that it is canon on its own, keep in mind that Nintendo has decanonized other Metroid material in the past, like the Blood of the Chozo storyline, or the Super Metroid comic. So on top of all the other arguments I've made for Samus and Joey, I think this tips the scales ever further in Samus and Joey's favor. AM2R was also stricken down by Nintendo, but I won't say that counts so as not to conflate in-universe logistics with real-life reasons for events occurring, as this game was shot down for using Nintendo's IP without explicit legal permission, but that's a whole nother story. The point is, Samus and Joey isn't 100% definitely canon, nor is it definitely non-canon, but there are substantial arguments working in its favor, enough so that I believe it's got the green light to be a part of the timeline. You could argue it's not if you really want to, but I think more signs than not point to it being canon, and honestly, why not consider it so? Saying it isn't just means less stories are a part of the franchise, which would only serve to weaken the character and universe, both figuratively and literally. Beyond my personal preference of it being canon though, it's confirmed by the author to be in the timeline, and among other arguments, I think it has to be there. All in all, nearly every major entry in this franchise's history is canon, leaving behind only a couple of projects with the non-canon status. Since I ordered the categories chronologically, I'll skim over the timeline one more time from beginning to end. The canon Metroid timeline, from beginning to end, is as follows. The Metroid prequel manga, Metroid 1, which stands for the original, and Zero Mission, Metroid Prime Hunters, Metroid Prime 2 Echoes, Metroid Prime 3 Corruption, Metroid Prime Federation Force, Metroid 2, which includes both Return of Samus and Samus Returns, Super Metroid, Metroid Other M, Samus and Joey, Metroid Fusion, and finally ends with the most recent new game, Metroid Dread. That, of course, leaves a few non-canon entries for the franchise, like Metroid Prime Pinball, the Super Metroid comic, or AM2R, among other works. There aren't too many non-canon entries, however. Metroid mostly sticks to canon material, as it maintains a strict and cohesive timeline, at least for Nintendo standards. I also didn't cover supplementary material like player's guides and game manuals, or other such things like that. I could cover those in a potential part 2, but only of course if you'd all like to see it. So what do you think? Are all of the entries in the series I called canon deserving of that title? Should Prime Pinball be included in the timeline? Would you want a part 2 covering material outside of the games and mangas? Let me know all about this, along with your general thoughts in the digital reply box down below, as station feedback is the best way to help the channel grow and improve with time. That's all for today's transmission. Thank you all for tuning in, be civil to each other, and I'll see you next broadcast.